Apple is widely recognized today as one of the most innovative and valuable technology companies in the world. Its sleek hardware and groundbreaking software have shaped how we interact with computers, music, phones, and more. Yet, for all the fanfare surrounding the iMac, the iPhone, and other game-changing products, many people forget that Apple went through a tumultuous era in the 1990s, an era so dire that the company came perilously close to bankruptcy. Today, we're going to journey back to that decade when Apple wrestled with fierce competition, boardroom showdowns, and misguided product strategy, only to claw its way back from the edge of disaster. By the end of this exploration, you'll see just how precarious Apple's fortunes were, and how a combination of leadership, product focus, and a bit of outside help managed to steer the company away from irrelevance. The story begins with the late 1980s, when Apple was still riding the momentum it had built on groundbreaking products like the Apple II and the original Macintosh. Co-founded by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in 1976, Apple had grown into a major force in the personal computer industry by the mid-1980s. The Macintosh, launched in 1984, introduced a graphical user interface and mouse, offering a user experience that was both novel and easier to use compared to the command-line interfaces common at the time. However, that initial momentum was overshadowed by clashes at the highest level. In 1985, Steve Jobs, who had championed the Macintosh with passionate zeal, left Apple after a power struggle with then CEO John Sculley. It was a major turning point, as Jobs was not only a public face of the company but also a driving force behind its product vision. In the aftermath of Jobs' departure, Apple still retained a strong brand identity. The Macintosh platform had a dedicated fan base, especially in education, desktop publishing, and creative industry. But from a business standpoint, Apple's market share faced pressure from IBM-compatible PCs running Microsoft's Windows. By the start of the 1990s, these PC clones flooded the market at lower prices, offering more hardware options and a rapidly improving Windows environment. Meanwhile, Apple maintained tight control over its hardware and software, charging a premium for its product. Though this model had historically given Apple a reputation for quality and integrated design, it put the company at a disadvantage as consumers and businesses opted for cheaper PC solutions. This evolving competitive landscape led Apple to experiment with a licensing program, allowing certain companies, like Power Computing, UMax, and Motorola, to produce Macintosh clones. The idea was to grow the Mac ecosystem without Apple having to bear all the manufacturing costs. Yet the program was fraught with complication, including potential cannibalization of Apple's own hardware sales. Worse, the profit margins that Apple historically enjoyed from its hardware were eroded, as these clone makers could undercut Apple on price. The licensing experiment ended up sowing confusion in the market, and over time it contributed to an identity crisis for Apple. Was it primarily a hardware company, a software company, or both? Nobody seemed to have a definitive answer. Meanwhile, leadership troubles persisted. John Sculley, who had initially done well by helping to popularize the Macintosh in the mainstream market, lost his footing as the decade wore on. In 1993, he was replaced as CEO by Michael Spindler, often called the Diesel for his intense work ethic. Spindler faced an uphill battle. Apple sales were dropping, the licensing program was floundering, and Microsoft was cementing its position as the de facto standard for personal computing with Windows 3.1 and, later, Windows 95. During this time, Apple tried to respond with new products like the Macintosh LC series and the PowerBook line, which were notable but never achieved the same level of cultural impact that the original Macintosh had enjoyed. Apple also made big bets on advanced but unfocused technology. It attempted to push into consumer electronics with the Newton, a personal digital assistant that launched in 1993. While innovative, featuring early handwriting recognition and mobile computing concepts, the Newton was hampered by technical shortcomings. The handwriting recognition was famously unreliable at launch, and the device itself was priced too high for mainstream adoption. This kind of ambitious yet poorly executed effort caused Apple to lose resources and focus at a critical time when simpler, more profitable products might have been the wiser path. The Newton remains an interesting footnote in Apple's history, foreshadowing the mobile computing future that would later be realized with the iPhone and iPad. Still, in the 1990s, it did little to stabilize Apple's precarious financial situation. By 1995, Microsoft released Windows 95, a leap forward that brought the familiar graphical user interface to a massive consumer base. This OS integrated features once exclusive to the Macintosh, like a trash can or recycle bin, and a more user-friendly interface. As a result, Apple's unique selling proposition, the ease of use of the Mac, was losing its edge in the broader market. That same year, Apple posted its first quarterly loss in years, signaling that the company was in deeper trouble than many realized. The huge success of Windows 95 overshadowed Apple's own system releases and made the Mac look increasingly niche. Michael Spindler left in 1996, replaced by Gil Amelio, a veteran of National Semiconductor. Amelio inherited a company that was awash in strategic missteps. One of the biggest problems was that Apple's operating system was growing long in the tooth. System 7, introduced in 1991, had been upgraded multiple times but still lacked key modern features like protected memory and full preemptive multitasking. In order to stay competitive, Apple needed to revamp its OS. Finding itself unable to engineer a next-generation operating system internally, Apple went shopping for outside technology. The two primary targets were BEOS, a fresh, modern OS created by former Apple executive Jean-Louis Gassi, and Next, the company Steve Jobs founded after leaving Apple. After some deliberation, and possibly influenced by personal connection, Apple acquired Next in late 1996 for $429 million, bringing Steve Jobs back into the Apple fold as an advisor. The reintroduction of Jobs was a watershed moment, though few realized at the time just how pivotal it would be. Gil Amelio envisioned Jobs' return mostly as a strategic partnership, leveraging Next's operating system technology, Next Step, to become the foundation for Apple's future OS. Jobs quietly observed Apple's operation, identifying deep structural problems. Meanwhile, the company continued hemorrhaging money. By early 1997, it was losing roughly $1.6 billion a year, with its share of the PC market shrinking to single digit. The writing on the wall was that Apple could go bankrupt if drastic changes were not made. 6 months after Amelio brought Jobs back, Apple's board ousted Amelio in favor of an interim CEO, none other than Steve Jobs himself. It was a decisive action spurred by mounting investor dissatisfaction and a sagging stock price. Jobs swiftly began re-engineering Apple from the inside out. One of his first steps was to drastically cut product line, eliminating unprofitable or unfocused ventures. The famous four-quadrant product strategy emerged around this time: consumer desktop, consumer portable, professional desktop, and professional portable. Everything else was either axed or rethought. This dramatic reduction in product sprawl not only slashed costs but also clarified Apple's product vision. Another bold and controversial move was the announcement of a partnership with Microsoft in 1997 at that year's Macworld Expo. In a moment that stunned the crowd, Jobs invited Bill Gates to appear on screen via satellite feed. Microsoft agreed to invest $150 million in Apple via non-voting shares, and pledged to continue developing Microsoft Office for Mac for 5 more years. In return, Apple made Internet Explorer the default browser on the Macintosh. The deal was met with boos from some of the die-hard Apple faithful, who saw Microsoft as the arch-rival. Yet this partnership infused Apple with much-needed cash and signaled to the market that the company had at least a temporary lifeline. Most importantly, it demonstrated that even Apple's biggest competitor recognized some ongoing value in keeping the Mac platform alive. During this period, Jobs also ended the Macintosh clone licensing program, reasoning, correctly, as it turned out, that Apple needed to retain control of its hardware ecosystem. The clone initiative had eroded Apple's profit margins without significantly growing the overall Mac market. By closing that chapter, Apple could go back to what it did best, designing and manufacturing its own computers with a unique synergy of hardware and software. Once the immediate crisis was contained, Jobs shifted focus to Apple's future. Under his guidance, the NUS step-based operating system metamorphosed into Mac OS X. This modernized OS was built on a Unix-based core, bringing advanced stability, multitasking, and other robust features that could stand toe-to-toe with Microsoft's offering. The development path from Next Step to Mac OS X would take a few more years, but it represented a reinvention of Apple's core software platform, a necessary step for staying relevant in the next decade. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac, a brightly colored, all-in-one personal computer that combined fresh industrial design with cutting-edge technologies like USB and Ethernet. The iMac was an instant hit, capturing the public's imagination and revitalizing Apple's brand. It arrived at a time when the Internet was exploding in popularity, and the iMac's emphasis on easy Internet connectivity gave the product a distinctive marketing edge. This was also the first major product under Jobs' renewed leadership that truly reflected his design-centric philosophy. Simplicity, elegance, and a playful aesthetic returned to Apple's identity. The iMac's success put the company back on stable financial ground, demonstrating that there was still a large audience eager for Apple's blend of innovation and style. While Apple had not fully regained all the market share it once held, the positive response to the iMac proved that the brand still resonated powerfully with consumers. Jobs quickly followed the iMac's success by unveiling other new products like the iBook and revamping the professional lineup with the Power Mac G3 and G4. These devices leveraged the same design language and user-friendly ethos. By the turn of the millennium, Apple was profitable again and had regained a measure of respect from both customers and Wall Street. Though it wouldn't yet be the colossal powerhouse it is today, the foundation was set for future triumphs like the iPod, released in 2001, the iPhone, 2007, and the iPad, 2010. It is worth emphasizing how close Apple came to folding in the 1990s. The company suffered quarterly losses of hundreds of millions of dollars, laid off thousands of employees, and struggled through multiple leadership changes. At times, Apple's stock price dipped perilously low, and rival tech giants or potential investors questioned whether Apple even had a future. The media openly speculated about a possible acquisition. Companies such as Sun Microsystems and even IBM were rumored as potential buyers. The possibility that Apple could simply vanish from the computer landscape felt very real. Critical to Apple's survival was Steve Jobs' capacity to re-establish a sense of purpose and direction. Jobs famously said that focus means saying no to the 100 other good ideas, and that's precisely what he did. By canceling product lines that did not serve the core vision, he reinvested Apple's limited resources into projects that would have a definitive impact on the market. While he is often lauded for his iconic keynote presentations and insistence on perfect design, it was that ruthless focus and clarity that paved the way for Apple's revival. Every step, whether it was forging a temporary alliance with Microsoft or betting on colorful translucent plastic for the iMac, served the strategic goal of rebuilding Apple's distinct brand identity. And it worked. The near-death experience Apple went through in the 1990s also instilled a new resilience and adaptability. The company learned how to pivot quickly, how to leverage its brand where it counted, and how to form strategic partnerships when necessary. These lessons, painful as they were, equipped Apple with a mindset to launch revolutionary products in subsequent decades. The iPod, iPhone, and iPad would later cement Apple's place in history, but none of those would have been possible if Apple hadn't survived the 1990s by the skin of its teeth. The significance of that period cannot be overstated. It reminded the tech industry that even beloved brands can find themselves on the ropes if they fall behind in product development, lose sight of customer needs, or fail to innovate at a competitive pace. Apple's predicament was partly of its own making: complex product lines, inconsistent software upgrades, lackluster management, but it was also exacerbated by the sheer power of Microsoft's domination in the PC space. That said, the 1990s saga also showed Apple's enduring capacity to execute a turnaround against steep odds, buoyed by a mixture of creativity, design sense, and a knack for strategic partnership. It took a second act from its visionary co-founder to steer the company away from oblivion and into a new era of prosperity. Reflecting on that era from the vantage point of the present day, it's astonishing to consider just how much the tech world could have changed if Apple had gone under. Many of the interface and hardware innovations that we now take for granted might never have come to fruition, or, at least, might have emerged in significantly different forms, possibly under other companies. Today, Apple stands as a towering figure in consumer electronics, not merely a PC manufacturer. It is the creator of entire ecosystem, iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, macOS, that tie hardware and software together seamlessly. The seeds for this integrated approach were planted decades ago, but were nearly uprooted by the financial crises of the 1990s. Hence, Apple's 1990s tale is more than just a historical footnote. It's a lesson in how quickly fortunes can change in the technology sector and how essential a unified vision is to a company's survival. For a time, Apple lost sight of who it was, pursuing half-realized strategies and products without a coherent direction. Only by regaining that sense of identity did it avoid the fate that befell so many other once great companies in Silicon Valley's storied past. In the end, the almost failure of Apple is not just about mismanagement, cutthroat competition, or ill-advised product line. It is a narrative about rediscovering core values, prioritizing the right innovations, and having a leadership team bold enough to make risky bets, and, on occasion, to swallow pride for the sake of strategic alliances. The transformation Apple underwent in the second half of the 1990s laid the groundwork for the unprecedented success we see today, from the staggering success of the iPod in the early 2000s to the global phenomenon of the iPhone and beyond. If Apple's story in the 90s teaches us anything, it's that the path to greatness is seldom a straight line. There are peaks and valleys, moments of clarity and instances of near-catastrophic error. Yet for Apple, that tumultuous decade was the crucible in which it re-honed its identity, found new momentum, and prepared to dominate the tech landscape in ways no one would have predicted when the company's survival seemed all but doomed. It's a powerful reminder that even at the brink of failure, the right vision, leadership, and product focus can rekindle a spark and set a company on a trajectory that changes the world.